When a lost horse trapped at the bottom of an old well uncovers secrets long buried, an entire community will be forced to confront the price of a forgotten legacy. The morning light began to filter through the cracks in the wooden window when Flash's insistent barking echoed through the century-old house. Mrs. Eleanor, a 72-year-old woman who had lost her sight after a degenerative disease, woke up startled. Her grey hair framed a face marked by time, but with an expression of firmness that the years had not managed to erase. "What is it, Flash? What's happening?" she asked, extending her hand to touch the fur of her faithful guide dog. Flash, Afi. Golden Labrador remained restless, walking in circles around the room, his bristling fur indicating that something was wrong. In 20 years together, Eleanor had never seen him so agitated in the early hours of the morning. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she touched the adapted alarm clock on the bedside table. 5:30 in the morning. Too early for any visitors, she thought. With her cane in one hand and the other leaning on Flash, Eleanor rose slowly. The cold of Golden Creek, typical of Virginia mornings even in warmer times, made her wrap the shawl more tightly around her shoulders. "Let's see what's bothering you," she said, with the calmness of someone who has learned to interpret the world through other senses. Star Ranch, her property for more than 4 decades, was a true sensory map for Eleanor. Each room, each corridor, each stone on the exterior path was registered in her tactile memory. The stone and wood house, built more than 2 centuries ago, held stories that few knew. As she walked down the hallway leading to the kitchen, Eleanor smelled the coffee that Mrs. Clara, her housekeeper and longtime friend, had prepared the night before. But Flash wasn't guiding her to the kitchen. The animal was pulling her toward the back door, which gave access to the ranch's extensive grounds. "Flash, wait, at least let me put on my shoes," she said, feeling the cold floor beneath her feet. At that moment, the front door opened, and the sound of hurried footsteps invaded the living room. "Mrs. Eleanor, you're already awake?" The young and breathless voice belonged to Caleb, the ranch's horse handler. "I'm sorry to come in like this, but something strange happened on the east side of the property." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. The east side was what they called the Old Land, an area she rarely visited since the passing of her husband, Arthur. "What happened, Caleb?" she asked, gripping the cane handle more tightly. "You better come with me. There's something, or someone, in the old well." Flash barked again as if confirming the urgency of the situation. "Let me just change my clothes," Eleanor replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite the apprehension she was beginning to feel. Minutes later, guided by Flash and supported by Caleb, Eleanor crossed the garden of aromatic herbs she had strategically planted to orient herself. The smell of rosemary on the right and mint on the left formed her own navigation system. As they moved away from the main house, the path became more irregular. Eleanor's boots sank slightly into the earth, damp with the morning dew. The silence was broken only by the song of some birds and the distant sound of the creek that cut through the property. "We're getting there, Mrs. Eleanor. Watch out for the stones in the path," warned Caleb, holding the elderly woman's arm gently. It was then that Eleanor heard it, a strange sound like a lament coming from beneath the ground. Flash stopped barking and began to whimper softly, as if responding to that mysterious call. "Caleb, what is that I'm hearing?" "It's a horse, Mrs. Eleanor. It's at the bottom of the old well," Caleb replied, his voice trembling with concern. "I don't know how it got there. The well was covered with old boards. Someone must have removed them." Eleanor felt her heart tighten. A suffering animal was something she couldn't bear. She gripped Caleb's arm more firmly and quickened her pace, despite the difficulty of the uneven terrain. "How did you discover it so early, my boy?" she asked while Flash continued ahead, as if guiding the way. "I've been doing rounds in the early morning, Mrs. Eleanor. Ever since Mr. Alexander Morgan started showing up around here with those men of his, I don't trust leaving the animals." Unguarded. The name Alexander Morgan made Eleanor furrow her brow. The wealthy businessman from the region had shown a suspicious interest in Star Ranch in recent months, especially after discovering the special lineage of horses bred by Arthur. "You think that—" "No, it can't be," she murmured, refusing to believe that someone would be capable of such cruelty. They finally reached the site. The smell of damp earth and moss was stronger there. Eleanor could feel the moisture in the air and hear more clearly the anguished moans of the animal. "The well is very deep, Mrs. Eleanor. I've already called some men from the neighboring ranch to help with the rescue. They should arrive any moment." Eleanor approached the edge of the well, guided by Caleb. She bent down and extended her hand, feeling the irregular stones covered in moss that formed the ancient structure. The well had been built during colonial times, when the ranch was a stopping point for drovers. "Is he badly injured?" asked Eleanor, as her fingers traced the outline of the stones. "I can't see clearly, it's too dark down there, but he seems exhausted. He must have been there for several hours." The idea of an animal suffering for so long made Eleanor's determination grow. She stood up with Caleb's help. "Go get ropes, tarps, and anything that can help with the rescue. I'll stay here with Flash, talking to the horse to calm it down." Caleb hesitated for a moment. "Are you sure? It's not safe to stay here alone." "Go, my boy." "Flash is with me, and I know this place better than you imagine. I've been here many times with Arthur." As soon as Caleb walked away, Eleanor sat on a rock near the well. Flash lay down beside her, vigilant. She began to speak in a low voice, a melodious tone she used to use with frightened horses. "Easy, little one. We'll get you out of there soon. Be patient." As she spoke, her mind wandered to the past. Arthur always said that the old land held secrets, stories that intertwined with the very history of Golden Creek. He had shown her the well, explaining that it was one of the oldest in the region and that, according to local legends, it had been dug by slaves in search of a gold vein. The sound of footsteps interrupted her memories. It wasn't Caleb. The steps were heavier and more determined. Flash began to growl softly. "Who's there?" asked Eleanor, rising with the help of her. "Kane?" "Good morning, Mrs. Eleanor. I didn't expect to find you in these parts so early." The deep and falsely cordial voice belonged to Alexander Morgan. Eleanor felt a wave of antipathy run through her body. The 55-year-old businessman had become a constant and unwelcome presence in her life since the discovery about the horses. "Fiat Star Ranch, what are you doing on my property uninvited, Mr. Morgan?" she asked, maintaining the erect and dignified posture that always characterized her. "I was passing by and saw your handler running desperately. I imagined something had happened. I came to offer help," he replied, approaching the well. "Ah, I see we have a problem here. An animal fell into the old well." The falsely concerned tone didn't fool Eleanor. She might not be able to see Morgan's face, but years of dealing with people had taught her to detect falsehood in someone's voice. "A horse has been trapped down there since last night, apparently," she said, turning in the direction of his voice. "Caleb went to get equipment for the rescue." "A horse, is it? What an interesting coincidence, just now that we're negotiating about your breeding program." Eleanor felt a chill. They weren't negotiating anything. Morgan had made offers, all refused by her. "There is no negotiation whatsoever, Mr. Morgan. I've made it clear that the horses of Star Ranch are not for sale." Before Morgan could respond, voices were heard approaching. Caleb was returning, accompanied by 3 strong men carrying ropes and equipment. "Mrs. Eleanor, I got help from Mr. Joshua and—" Caleb stopped when he saw Morgan. "Mr. Morgan, what are you doing here?" "I came to offer help, young man. After all, we're all neighbors, aren't we?" replied Morgan with a smile that only Caleb could see. "Let's start the rescue," interrupted Eleanor, sensing the tension in the air. "The animal has suffered enough already." The rescue of the horse was a difficult operation that lasted almost 2 hours. Under the sun that was beginning to rise in the sky of Golden Creek, the men worked tirelessly. Caleb descended into the well tied by ropes, placed a supporting structure around the exhausted animal, and with the help of the others, they managed to hoist it to the surface. Eleanor, who waited anxiously for the result, heard the sound of the animal touching solid ground and carefully approached, guided by Flash. Her trembling fingers touched the wet, mud-covered fur of the horse that was breathing heavily, lying on the grass. "How is he, Caleb?" she asked, concern permeating her voice. "He's alive, Mrs. Eleanor, thank God. He seems exhausted and frightened, but I don't see any serious injuries. I'll examine him better when we take him to the stable." Alexander Morgan, who had observed the entire rescue while keeping his distance, then approached the animal. His scrutinizing eyes examined every detail of the mud-covered horse. "That's quite an animal," he commented, crouching down to get a better look. "From the structure, it seems to be from the special lineage that your husband used to breed." Eleanor felt uncomfortable with Morgan's presence. Something in his voice indicated, "Much more than a simple observation. I can't confirm." "That now, Mr. Morgan. The animal needs immediate care." Morgan stood up and cleaned his hands on the handkerchief he took from his pocket. Of course. But after he's recovered, I'd like to examine him more closely. I have a particular interest in the lineage developed by the late Arthur." Before Eleanor could respond, the horse neighed weakly, trying to get up. Caleb quickly came to its aid, stroking its neck and speaking words of comfort. "Easy, boy. We're going to take care of you," said the young handler, examining the animal with an experienced eye. It was at that moment that Caleb noticed something on the horse's flank. Even under the layer of mud, it was possible to distinguish a peculiar mark. "Mrs. Eleanor," he called with a trembling voice of excitement, "I think you should feel this." Guided by Caleb's hand, Eleanor's sensitive fingers touched a region on the animal's flank where the skin formed a raised design like an old scar. "What is it, Caleb? Describe it to me." "It's a mark, Mrs. Eleanor. It looks like a 5-pointed star with a circle around it. I've never seen this on any other horse in the region." Eleanor felt her heart accelerate. That description awakened memories of old conversations with Arthur. He had mentioned that the most special horses of his lineage were born with a natural mark, something he considered almost mystical, a signature of nature that confirmed the purity of the blood. "It's not possible," she murmured. "I thought that lineage had been lost after Arthur's passing." Morgan, who was observing everything closely, intervened. "What are you talking about? What mark is that?" Eleanor hesitated. Something told her not to share that information with Morgan. "Nothing important, just an unusual birthmark," she replied, trying to sound unconcerned. "Caleb, we need to take this animal to the stable immediately. He needs water, food, and a dry place to rest." The men improvised a stretcher with the tarp they had brought and carefully transported the horse to the stables of Star Ranch. Eleanor accompanied everything, supported by Flash and her cane, and Morgan followed them, maintaining an oddly silent demeanor. In the stable, the animal was placed in a clean and spacious stall. Caleb immediately began to clean its coat, gradually revealing its true color, an intense golden, almost like bronze polished in the sun. "It's the most beautiful horse I've ever seen," commented Mr. Joshua, one of the neighbors who had helped with the rescue. "It looks like those horses from old stories, the ones only kings rode." Eleanor smiled for the first time on that tense morning. "We need to give him a name," she said, approaching to touch the animal again, "something that represents his strength and his beauty." "How about Star?" suggested Caleb, "because of the mark and the name of the ranch." "Star?" repeated Eleanor as if testing the sound of the name. "Yes, it suits him. From today on, this is Star, the new guardian of Star Ranch." Morgan, who had been observing everything with growing interest, finally spoke. "Mrs. Eleanor, I would like to make an offer for this animal. I'm willing to pay a considerable sum." Silence fell over the stable. Eleanor turned in the direction of Morgan's voice, her posture becoming more rigid. "Mr. Morgan, I appreciate your offer, but Star is not for sale. He has just been rescued and needs rest. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a lot of work ahead." Morgan cleared his throat, a sound that denoted his dissatisfaction with the response. "Think carefully, Mrs. Eleanor. A lady of your age living alone on this large ranch. The money could provide more comfort for you." Before Eleanor could respond, Caleb intervened. "Mr. Morgan, Mrs. Eleanor has already expressed her decision. Respectfully, we ask that you leave the stable now. We have an animal to care for." Morgan adjusted his jacket, visibly annoyed. "Very well, but think about my offer, Mrs. Eleanor. I'll return in a few days to talk again." After Morgan's departure, Eleanor let out a tired sigh. "Caleb, I need you to do something for me." In Arthur's office, in the second drawer of the desk on the right, there's a leather-bound notebook. "Bring it to me, please." Arthur's office had remained untouched since his departure 5 years ago. It was a sanctuary of memories that Eleanor maintained as if at any moment her husband might return and find everything exactly as he had left it. The smell of old books and leather mingled with the sweet aroma of pipe tobacco that seemed impregnated in the wooden walls. Caleb entered hesitantly into that sacred space. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the windows covered by lace curtains, creating golden patterns on the solid mahogany desk. With reverence, he opened the second drawer and found the notebook described by Eleanor. Brown leather cover, worn by constant use, with the initials AS embossed in low relief. When he returned to the stable, Eleanor was sitting on a small stool near Star's stall, stroking the animal's neck as it drank water avidly. Flash rested at her feet, vigilant as always. "I found the notebook, Mrs. Eleanor," said Caleb, placing the object in the lady's hands. Eleanor caressed the cover tenderly, as if she were touching a part of Arthur himself. Her fingers traced the engraved initials, a tangible connection to the past. "Thank you, my boy." This notebook contains all the records of Arthur's special breeding program. He documented everything meticulously: crossings, characteristics, temperaments, and also the distinctive marks of the rarest animals. "Would you like me to read it to you?" offered Caleb. "Yes, please. Let's go to the house porch. Star needs to rest, and we also need to recover our strength after this hectic morning." On the wide porch of the main house, lulled by the sound of birds and the gentle afternoon breeze, Caleb began to read Arthur's writings to Eleanor. The yellowed pages revealed not only technical data about the horses, but also the personal reflections of a man passionate about his breeding program. March 3rd, 1995, read Caleb. "The colt from the crossing between Black Moon and Thunder was born today. A male with extraordinary golden coat. Even more impressive is the natural mark on his flank, a perfect star inside a circle. It's the third animal born with this mark in our breeding program. According to stories from old ranchers in the region, horses with this mark are direct descendants of the first horses brought by the English in the 18th century, a rare and almost legendary lineage." Eleanor listened attentively, nodding occasionally, immersed in the memories that those words evoked. "Continue, Caleb. Go to the last notes, those from 2018, shortly before Arthur left us." Caleb leafed through the notebook to the last written pages. The handwriting was shakier, reflecting Arthur's debilitated state of health in his final months. November 12, 2018. "Alexander Morgan visited the ranch today. His interest in our horses is concerning. He talked about buying the entire breeding, a program for a generous amount, as he himself said. I refused, of course. The Star lineage is not just a business, it's a cultural legacy that must be preserved. Morgan doesn't understand the historical and cultural value of these animals. He only sees the economic potential. I fear he won't easily accept my refusal." Eleanor pressed her lips, a gesture that Caleb already recognized as a sign of her deep concern. "He knew," she murmured. Arthur already suspected Morgan's intentions back then. Caleb continued reading. November 20th, 2018, we received disturbing news. 3 ranches in the region that maintained horses of the Old English lineage have been sold in the last few months, all to subsidiary companies of Morgan. The breeding programs were discontinued shortly after the acquisitions. This confirms my suspicions. Morgan is systematically eliminating traditional breeding programs to monopolize the market with his imported horses. It's an attempt to erase our history and replace it with a soulless commercial product without connection to our land. Eleanor's face reflected the gravity of those revelations. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together in her mind. "Arthur was always a visionary," she commented. "He perceived Morgan's plan before anyone else, and now, with the mysterious appearance of Star, everything makes even more sense." "What do you think happened to Star? How did he end up in the well?" asked Caleb, closing the notebook. Eleanor reflected for a moment, her fingers drumming lightly on the arm of the rocking chair. I don't believe in coincidences, my boy. The fact that we found a horse with the star mark precisely now that Morgan has intensified his harassment to buy the ranch. Someone wanted this animal to disappear. Do you think Morgan... I don't want to make accusations without proof, Caleb, but we need to be vigilant. From today on, I want you and 2 more trusted men to take turns guarding the stables, especially Star's stall. Mrs. Clara, who had remained in the kitchen preparing lunch while the morning's events unfolded, approached the porch with a tray containing tea and cookies. You need to eat, Mrs. Eleanor, she said, with the familiarity of someone who has lived together for decades. All this stress is not good for your health. Thank you, Clara, you're always taking care of me, replied Eleanor with a tired smile. Clara, do you remember those stories that Arthur used to tell about the special horses of Star Ranch? Of course I do. Mr. Arthur used to say they had royal blood, that they descended from the horses of the English court. He said they weren't just animals, but guardians of a tradition. Exactly, confirmed Eleanor, taking a cup of tea. And now, it seems we've found the last of them. 3 days passed since Star's rescue. The animal was recovering quickly, showing surprising vitality for one who had spent hours trapped in a dark well. His golden coat, now clean and brushed daily by Caleb, shone under the sunlight that entered through the cracks in the stable. Eleanor spent long hours beside the horse, talking to him as if he were a person, telling stories about Arthur and about the glorious times of Star Ranch. There was a special connection between the blind lady and the rescued animal, something almost mystical that even the most skeptical ranch workers commented on in respectful whispers. On that Thursday morning, while Eleanor was sitting on a small stool near Star's stall, the sound of a car approaching caught her attention. Flash, who was resting at her feet, raised his head and let out a low growl. Who could it be this time, my friend? Murmured Eleanor, stroking the dog's head to calm him. Firm footsteps and the jingling of keys announced Caleb's arrival. Mrs. Eleanor, it's Mr. Morgan again. He's accompanied by 2 men I've never seen before. They want to speak with you. Eleanor sighed deeply. She had been expecting this. She had read more pages of Arthur's diary in the last few days and knew that Morgan's insistence was just the beginning of a broader conflict. Tell them to meet me on the house porch, Caleb. I don't want Morgan near Star. Leaning on her cane and guided by Flash, Eleanor slowly headed to the main house. Upon reaching the porch, she settled into her favorite rocking chair, the one that had belonged to her mother and, before her, to her grandmother. It was as if the wisdom of generations of strong women was impregnated in that simple piece of furniture, giving her strength to face what was to come. Good morning, Mrs. Eleanor. Morgan's falsely cordial voice sounded closer than she expected. I hope you've recovered from the shock of that day. I'm perfectly fine, Mr. Morgan, and Star is also recovering admirably, she replied, maintaining a polite but firm tone. Great, great, said Morgan, and Eleanor could hear the scraping of a chair being positioned in front of her. Allow me to introduce Dr. Paul Matthews, an equine specialist, and Mr. Richard Vance, legal advisor to Morgan Enterprises. Gentlemen, greeted Eleanor with a nod, to what do I owe the official visit with so many advisors, Mr. Morgan? The sound of papers being handled reached Eleanor's attentive ears. I've come to make a formal proposal, Mrs. Eleanor, replied Morgan, his tone now more serious and calculated. Dr. Matthews confirmed my suspicions after briefly seeing the animal on the day of the rescue. That horse you found in the well is most likely a direct descendant of the Royal English lineage, extremely rare nowadays. So what? Asked Eleanor, feigning disinterest, although her heart had accelerated. So, my dear lady, continued Morgan, with a tone that mixed condescension and impatience, I am willing to pay a significant amount for him, well above market value. The sound of a pen scratching paper was followed by approaching footsteps. Eleanor felt a paper being placed in her hand. Is your legal advisor giving me a contract? She asked, raising the paper as if she could read it. It's just a memorandum. With the basic terms, explained Vance, with the monotonous voice of a lawyer accustomed to negotiations. The amount is on the last line, in figures and spelled out. Eleanor extended the paper in the direction where she knew Caleb was standing, silently observing everything. "Could you read it to me, Caleb?" Caleb took the paper and read aloud, his expression changing from surprise to suspicion. $200,000 for the horse, he said, incredulous. "It's a considerable sum, Mrs. Eleanor." A heavy silence fell over the porch. Eleanor rocked gently in the chair, as if pondering the offer. In fact, she was trying to organize her thoughts and understand why Morgan was so interested in Star. "It's a very generous offer, Mr. Morgan," she finally said. "But as I've told you before, Star is not for sale." Morgan let out an exasperated sigh. "Mrs. Eleanor, with all due respect, you need to be practical. Star Ranch is no longer what it was in your husband's time. You are alone, of advanced age, and with a visual impairment that makes managing the property difficult. This money could provide you with a peaceful old age, without worries." Eleanor felt her blood boil at those condescending words, but she maintained her composure. Years of experience had taught her that showing anger was rarely an effective strategy. "I appreciate your concern for my well-being, Mr. Morgan, but I am perfectly capable of taking care of my property and my animals. Caleb and my team are competent and dedicated." "But none of them has Arthur's knowledge about horse breeding," retorted Morgan, his voice now betraying irritation. "That animal is too valuable to stay in an old stable, cared for by an inexperienced young man." Caleb took a step forward, visibly offended, but Eleanor raised her hand, signaling for him to contain himself. "Dr. Matthews, your specialist, could tell me exactly why this horse is so valuable to you?" asked Eleanor, addressing where she imagined the veterinarian would be. There was a moment of hesitation before a grave and professional voice responded. "The mark on the animal's flank is characteristic of the Royal English lineage, brought to America in the 18th century. They are genetically unique animals, with exceptional physical and temperamental characteristics, resistant, intelligent, and with impressive muscle memory." "And this lineage is rare nowadays?" insisted Eleanor. "Extremely," confirmed Dr. Matthews. "It was believed, in fact, to be extinct in America. The last official record we had was of an animal that belonged precisely to your husband, Arthur Sanders, who passed away more than 5 years ago without leaving documentation about the animal's fate." Eleanor nodded slowly, the pieces of the puzzle fitting together in her mind. "I see. And Mr. Morgan wishes to have this animal to preserve this rare lineage, I suppose?" An uncomfortable silence followed the question. "Mr. Morgan is a great enthusiast of purebred horses," finally responded the lawyer Vance with a note of falsehood that didn't escape Eleanor's attentive ears. "Yes, I'm a collector," added Morgan quickly. "I have a modern horse farm with cutting-edge technology. I can offer the animal conditions far superior to what he has here." Eleanor shook her head, a sad smile forming on her lips. "Mr. Morgan, I know well the reputation of your horse farm. You import European horses of famous lineages, cross them to obtain specimens for competition, and sell their offspring for exorbitant values. It's a lucrative business, no doubt, but Star is not just an animal of commercial value. He represents something deeper, the history of this land, my husband's legacy, and a tradition that transcends monetary value." Morgan rose abruptly, his chair scraping on the wooden floor. "You're making a mistake, Mrs. Eleanor. Think carefully. This offer won't stand forever." Eleanor also stood up, leaning on her cane, her erect and dignified posture contrasting with her apparent fragility. "My answer is final, Mr. Morgan. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a ranch to manage." When the footsteps of the visitors moved away and the sound of the car engine faded in the distance, Caleb approached Eleanor. "Are you sure, Mrs. Eleanor? $200,000 is a lot of money." "I'm sure, Caleb," she replied, sitting back in the rocking chair. "There's something Morgan isn't telling us, and I'm going to find out what it is before it's too late." That same night, while Eleanor was trying to sleep, Flash began to bark furiously toward the window. Before she could call for help, she heard the sound of glass breaking and the acrid smell of smoke invaded her room. "Fire! Flash, take me outside!" shouted Eleanor, covering her nose and mouth with the sleeve of her nightgown as she hurriedly rose from the bed. The guide dog, trained for emergency situations, immediately grabbed the special handle sewn onto his collar with his mouth, placing it within Eleanor's reach. She grabbed the handle and let herself be guided by the animal, who knew every inch of that house. Flash led her away from the smoke, following the hallway to the back door, away from the focus of the fire. On the way, Eleanor shouted at the top of her lungs, "Caleb! Mrs. Clara! Fire! Wake up!" Upon reaching the back door, Flash pushed it open with his muzzle and guided Eleanor to the yard. The fresh night air contrasted with the smoke that now escaped through the windows of the east wing of the house, where Arthur's old office was located. "Mrs. Eleanor?" The anguished voice of Mrs. Clara sounded a few meters away. "Thank God you're all right." "Clara, where's Caleb and the others? Did everyone manage to get out?" asked Eleanor, gripping the housekeeper's arms tightly. "Caleb went to check the stables as soon as he saw the fire. He feared they might try to target the animals too. George and Peter are trying to control the flames with the garden hose, and we've already called the fire department." Eleanor felt a tightness in her chest. It wasn't a coincidence. The fire had started precisely in the office where all of Arthur's documents were kept, including the complete records of the horses of the Star lineage. "Clara, take me to the stables. I need to be sure that Star is safe." "But Mrs. Eleanor, it's dangerous. You just escaped from the fire." "Please, Clara, it's important." Reluctantly, Mrs. Clara gave in. Along with Flash, she helped Eleanor cross the yard to the stables, which were about 100 meters from the main house. As they approached, they could hear agitated neighing and human voices in tones of urgency. "Caleb," called Eleanor when they sensed movement ahead. "What's happening?" "Mrs. Eleanor." Caleb's voice sounded breathless and tense. "Thank God you're all right. They tried to take Star. I found 2 men forcing the stable door. They fled when they saw me, but I'm sure they weren't just common cattle thieves." "Is Star okay?" asked Eleanor, her heart racing. "He's frightened, but physically fine. I put him in the innermost stall and locked everything. George is armed and will stand guard tonight." In the distance, the sound of fire truck sirens could be heard approaching. Eleanor felt a mixture of relief for the help that was coming and concern for what was to come. There was no longer any doubt in her mind. Someone was determined to obtain Star at any cost, even if it meant destroying important documents or, worse yet, harming innocent people. "Mrs. Eleanor," an unfamiliar female voice called. "I'm Lieutenant Rebecca from the fire department. I need you and everyone to move further away from the property while we fight the fire." "My house," murmured Eleanor, feeling tears escape from her eyes. That house held not just objects, but memories of an entire life shared with Arthur. "We'll do our best to save as much as we can," assured the lieutenant. "But now I need you to go to a safe location." The following hours passed in a blur of activity and emotion. Eleanor, Mrs. Clara, Caleb, and the other ranch employees waited tensely in the tool shed, hastily transformed into an improvised command post. Flash remained by his owner's side, his head resting in her lap, offering the silent comfort that only a dedicated animal can provide. When Lieutenant Rebecca finally returned, her tone was gentle but direct. "We managed to control the fire. Mrs. Eleanor, the east wing of the house suffered significant damage, especially the office, which was almost completely destroyed. But the rest of the structure is intact, although with smoke and water damage." Eleanor nodded, trying to process the information. The office, precisely where all of Arthur's documents were. "Lieutenant," she said, keeping her voice firm despite the circumstances, "this was not an accident. Someone tried to set fire to my house at the same time that others tried to steal my horse." "Yes, your employee Caleb already informed me about the attempted theft at the stable," replied the lieutenant. "We've initiated an investigation and are treating the case as arson and attempted theft. I'll need everyone to give statements tomorrow, but for now the most important thing is to ensure you have a safe place to spend the night." "You can stay at my house, Mrs. Eleanor," offered Mr. Joshua, the neighbor who had helped rescue Star days before. "I have vacant rooms since my children moved out." "Thank you, Joshua," thanked Eleanor, moved by the solidarity. "But I prefer to stay here at the ranch. I can't leave the animals, especially Star. Caleb and I will stay in the guest room of the caretaker's house, which wasn't affected by the fire." "I'll stay with you, Mrs. Eleanor," declared Mrs. Clara immediately. I won't leave you alone at a time like this." In the improvised shelter, while Caleb and other employees talked with the police who had arrived to investigate, Mrs. Clara prepared a tea for Eleanor and sat beside her. "Do you think it was Mr. Morgan?" she asked in a low voice so that only Eleanor could hear. "I don't have proof, Clara," replied Eleanor, holding the teacup with slightly trembling hands. "But it's too much of a coincidence, don't you think? First he appears wanting to buy Star. For a fortune I refuse, and on the same night someone tries to set fire precisely to the room where all the documents proving the animal's lineage were kept. And what do you intend to do now?" Eleanor inhaled deeply, feeling a determination grow within her. It was the same kind of strength she had felt when Arthur fell ill years ago and she had to take command of the ranch alone. "First, I'm going to ensure that Star is protected. Tomorrow I'll ask Caleb to take him to my nephew Paul's farm in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It's far enough away to keep him safe for now. Second, I'm going to find out what Morgan really wants with this horse. There's something we're not seeing. Clara, something that's worth much more than $200,000. Do you think it's just the rarity of the lineage?" Eleanor shook her head. "No. Arthur used to say that the horses of the Star lineage carried more than noble blood in their veins. They carried history. And sometimes, Clara, history is worth more than gold, especially to those who want to rewrite it." The next morning, as the first rays of sun illuminated the damage caused by the fire, a car parked on the dirt road leading to the headquarters of Star Ranch. From it descended a young woman, approximately 30 years old, curly hair tied in an unpretentious bun, and determined eyes behind thick-framed glasses. "Good morning," she greeted, approaching Caleb, who was supervising the cleaning of the debris. "My name is Hannah Richards. I'm a journalist with the Virginia Daily. I heard about the fire and would like to talk to Mrs. Eleanor Sanders." Caleb observed the journalist with suspicion. After the events of the previous night, any unknown person represented a potential threat to Star Ranch and its inhabitants. "How did you hear about the fire so quickly?" he questioned, crossing his arms in a defensive posture. Hannah adjusted, her glasses on her face with a habitual gesture, and sketched an understanding smile. "I monitor the fire department frequencies. I work mainly with investigative reporting on historical and cultural heritage in the region. A fire at Star Ranch, one of the oldest properties in Golden Creek, immediately caught my attention." Before Caleb could respond, Eleanor's firm voice sounded from the porch. "Let her in, Caleb. I want to talk to this young woman." Seated on the porch of the caretaker's house, with cups of fresh coffee prepared by Mrs. Clara, Eleanor and Hannah conversed as if they were old acquaintances. There was something in the journalist's voice, a mixture of genuine respect and intellectual curiosity, that made Eleanor feel she could trust her. "So, you believe the fire was not accidental," concluded Hannah after hearing a summary of recent events. "I am absolutely certain," affirmed Eleanor. "Too many coincidences in a short span of time. First we find Star, a horse with the characteristic mark of the Royal English lineage, trapped in an old well. Then Alexander Morgan appears wanting to buy him for an exorbitant amount. When I refuse, on the same night there's a fire in the office where I kept all the documents related to the breeding program, and they try to steal the animal." Hannah took notes quickly in her notebook. The sound of the pen sliding over the paper reached Eleanor's attentive ears. "You mentioned the Royal English lineage. Could you explain the importance of these horses? I confess I'm not an expert on equines." Eleanor adjusted herself in the chair, a slight nostalgic smile forming on her lips. It was a subject about which Arthur spoke with such passion that she had absorbed every detail over the years. The Royal English lineage was brought to America in the 18th century during the colonial period. They were horses of the English nobility, exceptional animals in terms of strength, endurance, and intelligence. Here in Virginia, especially in Golden Creek, these horses became a fundamental part of the history of gold mining. "How so?" asked Hannah, genuinely interested. "These horses were used to transport gold from the mines to the Crown's inspection points. They were the only ones capable of traversing the steep paths of the region with heavy loads and in adverse weather conditions. Over time, they began to be selected and crossed specifically for this function. The star-shaped mark on the flank was a natural symbol that appeared only in the purest specimens of the lineage. Hannah made more notes before asking, "And what happened to these horses after the decline of mining?" "Most disappeared over time. Indiscriminate crossings, neglect of lineage preservation. My husband Arthur was one of the few breeders who dedicated himself to preserving these animals. He researched, documented, found specimens hidden in remote farms. It was a work of decades." "And now Star may be the last of them," concluded Hannah. "Exactly. And someone is willing to do anything to obtain him. You suspect Alexander Morgan, right? What do you know about him?" Eleanor sighed, adjusting the shawl over her shoulders. "Enough to be suspicious. Morgan is a businessman in the construction and tourism industry. In recent years, he has bought several historic properties in Golden Creek and the surrounding region, supposedly to preserve them. But what happens in reality is that he transforms them into luxury hotels and tourist developments that completely decharacterize the original historical value." Hannah nodded, though Eleanor couldn't see the gesture. "I'm familiar with that modus operandi," said the journalist. "I've been investigating businessmen like him for years. They take advantage of loopholes in historical heritage preservation, legislation to transform century-old sites into commercial tourist attractions, often destroying original architectural elements or modifying them beyond recognition." "Exactly." Arthur suspected that Morgan had other interests in Star Ranch beyond the horses. The property is at a strategic point between the historic center of Golden Creek and the region of the old gold mines. It would be a perfect location for one of those tourist complexes he usually builds. "And you never considered selling the property?" "Never," replied Eleanor firmly. "This land has been in Arthur's family for generations. It's not just a ranch, it's a living piece of Virginia's history. Besides, I made a promise to my husband before his departure. I would keep Star Ranch running and preserve the legacy of the horses as long as I lived." Hannah was silent for a moment, as if organizing her thoughts. "Mrs. Eleanor, I think I can help you," she finally said. "I've been investigating Alexander Morgan for months for a report on real estate speculation in areas of historical heritage. I have information that could be useful to understand what he really wants with your property and with Star." "What kind of information?" "Documents, testimonies, records of suspicious business. I discovered that Morgan has connections with influential politicians and manages to get authorizations for constructions in protected areas with impressive ease. I've also found indications that he has used questionable methods to pressure owners to sell their lands." Eleanor pressed her hands in her lap, absorbing that information. The confirmation of her suspicions was both frightening and invigorating. "And what do you gain by helping me, Hannah?" she asked, direct as always. The journalist smiled, appreciating the lady's frankness. "A story, a great story about historical heritage preservation, corporate greed, and the resistance of an extraordinary woman. With your permission, of course, I would like to write about all this. But first, I want to help you understand what's happening and protect Star and Star Ranch." Eleanor reflected for a few moments. She needed allies, and her instinct told her she could trust this determined young woman. "Very well, Hannah. I accept your help. What do you suggest we do first?" "We need to understand why Star is so important to Morgan. $200,000 is a lot of money for a single horse, even if it's from a rare lineage. There must be something more." At that moment, Caleb approached with Flash at his side. The guide dog immediately went to Eleanor, placing his head in her lap in a gesture of comfort. "Mrs. Eleanor, I finished checking the stables. Star is fine but still agitated, and I found something strange near the back fence." "What did you find, Caleb?" "Footprints and tire marks that aren't from any of our vehicles. It seems someone was observing the property before the fire. And I found this stuck in one of the fence wires." Caleb placed a small piece of torn fabric in Eleanor's hand. "What is this?" she asked, feeling the material between her fingers. "It looks like a piece of uniform," replied Hannah, who was observing the object. "It has a partial embroidered emblem. It looks like the logo of Morgan's company, M.E., Morgan Enterprises." "Evidence," murmured Eleanor. "But probably not enough to formally accuse him." "Not yet," agreed Hannah, "but it's a start. Mrs. Eleanor, You mentioned that your husband kept detailed records about the horses of the Star lineage. Were they all destroyed in the fire? I'm afraid so. The office was completely consumed by the flames, along with books, documents, and family photographs. And there are no copies of these documents elsewhere. Eleanor furrowed her brow, thoughtful. Arthur was too methodical not to keep copies. Wait a moment. Her face lit up with a sudden memory. The computer. Arthur began digitizing his records in the last years of his life. He kept everything on an old computer that was in the bedroom, not in the office. The computer is intact, confirmed Caleb. The bedroom wasn't affected by the fire. We need to check this immediately, said Hannah, excitement evident in her voice. If we can access these digital records, we might discover what Morgan is really looking for. As they headed toward the main house, a car approached on the dirt road, raising dust. It was a police car, and from it descended a middle-aged man, grey hair and serious expression. Good morning, he greeted, approaching the group. I'm Sheriff Matthew Foster. I'm investigating the fire that occurred last night. I need to speak with the owner, Mrs. Eleanor Sanders. That's me, replied Eleanor, extending her hand. Thank you for coming personally, Sheriff. It's my duty, Ma'am, especially considering that we have evidence it was arson. We found remains of a homemade incendiary device among the ruins of the office. Hannah stepped forward. Sheriff, my name is Hannah Richards. I'm an investigative journalist with the Virginia Daily. I have information that might be relevant to your investigation, especially about possible motivations for the crime. The sheriff looked at the journalist with a mixture of interest and caution. I'm open to hearing any information that might help, Miss Richards, but first I need to take the formal statement of Mrs. Eleanor and the employees who were present on the night of the fire. I understand, said Eleanor. We can talk on the porch of the caretaker's house. It's the most comfortable place available at the moment, considering the state of the main house. As they walked, Hannah whispered to Eleanor, Don't mention the computer or the digital records yet. We need to check what's there before sharing that information with anyone, including the police. Eleanor nodded discreetly. Her instinct also told her to be cautious. If Morgan had influential contacts, as Hannah had suggested, it was better to keep some cards up her sleeve. During the next 2 hours, the sheriff listened attentively to the accounts of Eleanor, Caleb, and Mrs. Clara about the events of the previous night. He noted details about Morgan's visit and his offer for the horse, as well as the simultaneous attempted theft at the stable. It's a very suspicious sequence of events, commented the sheriff, closing his notebook. I'll summon Mr. Morgan to provide clarifications, and I'll increase patrols in this area for the next few days. Thank you, Sheriff, said Eleanor. We're all quite shaken by what happened. Knowing that the police are investigating gives us some peace of mind. After the sheriff's departure, Hannah, Eleanor, and Caleb finally headed to the room that Eleanor had shared with Arthur for decades. In a corner on a small table was an old desktop computer covered with a plastic case to protect it from dust. There it is, intact, said Caleb, removing the protective cover. I hope it still works. It hasn't been turned on for years. When the computer finally initialized, after several minutes of tense waiting, the screen displayed a photo of Eleanor and Arthur smiling, mounted on horses near a creek. Our trip to Niagara Falls, murmured Eleanor, recognizing the moment from the description Caleb had given her of the image. It was our 30th wedding anniversary. Hannah sat down at the computer and began navigating through the files, guided by Eleanor's instructions about where Arthur used to keep his records. I found a folder called Star Lineage, announced Hannah after a few minutes. It has dozens of files, genealogical records, digitized photographs, historical documents. Open the file Complete History, instructed Eleanor anxiously. It was the main document where Arthur compiled all his discoveries. Hannah clicked on the file, which opened, revealing an extensive document with over 200 pages, full of texts, old photographs, and detailed illustrations. It's amazing, murmured Hannah as she scrolled through the document. Your husband was extremely meticulous. There's information here that dates back to the 18th century, records of each animal in the lineage, old maps. He dedicated his life to this work, said Eleanor, with evident pride in her voice. For Arthur, it wasn't just a matter of preserving a rare breed of horses. It was preserving an important chapter in Virginia's history. But what would make these horses so valuable to someone like Morgan? Questioned Caleb, leaning to get a better view of the screen. He doesn't seem the type of man who cares about historical preservation. Hannah continued navigating through the document until she stopped abruptly at a section titled "The Route of the Diverted Gold." "I think I found something interesting," she said, adjusting her glasses. "During my research on the history of the Starr lineage," she began to read, "I discovered a fascinating and little-known aspect about the use of these horses during the gold cycle in Virginia. In addition to the official transport of gold taxed by the English crown, there existed a secret network of alternative paths used to divert part of the extracted gold, thus avoiding the 20% tax charged by the crown." "Yes, I remember that," interrupted Eleanor. "Arthur became obsessed with this discovery in recent years. He found old diaries that mentioned these secret paths, known only to some drovers and the owners of horses from the Starr lineage." Hannah continued reading. "The horses of the Starr lineage were specially trained to travel these alternative paths, memorize routes, and, most impressively, recognize specific natural landmarks that indicated locations where the diverted gold was temporarily hidden. This unusual capacity for spatial memory was improved over generations of selection and training, becoming a hereditary characteristic of the lineage." "Wait," interrupted Caleb, increasingly intrigued. "Does that mean these horses could find gold hideouts?" "Not exactly," explained Eleanor. "They were trained to recognize specific natural landmarks, rock formations, centennial trees, patterns in the terrain that served as reference points for gold smugglers. It was a form of living map, which couldn't be written down and therefore couldn't be discovered by the colonial authorities." Hannah turned her attention back to the document and continued scrolling through the text until she found a paragraph that made her eyes widen. "My God," she murmured. "Listen to this. In my most recent research, I found concrete evidence that one of the largest shipments of diverted gold, valued at approximately 400 kilos, never reached its final destination. According to private records of the Mendonça family, important mine owners in the 18th century, the shipment was hidden at some point on the secret route when a Crown patrol unexpectedly approached. The exact location of the hideout was recorded only in the trained memory of the Starr lineage horses that accompanied the caravan. The intention was to return days later to recover the gold, but an epidemic decimated most of those involved, taking this secret to the grave. The only written record mentions that the location would be where the Starr touches the water when the sun rises on the shortest day of the year." A heavy silence fell over the room as the three processed the implication of that information. "A treasure," whispered Caleb, "a real colonial treasure lost. And Starr may be the last living animal capable of finding it," completed Eleanor, finally understanding. "That's why Morgan wants him so badly. It's not just for the value of the animal itself, but for what he can reveal." "But how would this be possible?" questioned Hannah, skeptical. "We're talking about knowledge that would have to be transmitted through generations of horses over more than 2 centuries, it seems." "Unlikely," completed Eleanor with a slight smile. "Perhaps, but Arthur discovered something extraordinary about these animals. Their spatial memory capacity is unusual, almost supernatural, and more importantly, they seem to possess a kind of genetic memory transmitted from generation to generation." Arthur conducted tests with the last specimens of the Starr lineage, taking them to specific locations mentioned in the old records, without any prior training. In more than 80% of the cases, the animals demonstrated specific behaviors when passing through these points: agitation, change in walking rhythm, tendency to deviate onto specific paths. "And Morgan discovered this," concluded Hannah. "He must have discovered it," agreed Eleanor. "Arthur presented some of his preliminary discoveries at a history conference in Richmond shortly before he fell ill. He didn't specifically mention the lost gold, but he talked about the exceptional spatial memory of the Starr lineage and its historical importance during the gold cycle. Hannah went back to examining the document on the computer, quickly scrolling through the following sections. Did your husband map the possible locations where the treasure could be? He had several theories, replied Eleanor. In the last months before his illness worsened, Arthur was planning an expedition with the last horse of the star lineage we owned at the time. He believed that by following the old drover paths and observing the animal's behavior, he could identify the location mentioned in the records. Unfortunately, he fell ill before realizing this plan, and the horse died shortly after. But now we have Star, said Caleb, with renewed enthusiasm. And the mark on his flank is identical to that described in the records of the purest animals of the lineage, which means he may have this genetic memory more preserved than any other, completed Eleanor. Hannah closed the file and looked seriously at Eleanor and Caleb. This explains a lot. Morgan's insistence, the generous financial offer, the fire aimed at destroying these records. He wants to find this colonial treasure and believes Star is the key. What do we do now? Asked Caleb. If what we suspect is true, Morgan won't give up easily. Eleanor remained silent for a few moments, reflecting deeply. When she finally spoke, her voice carried an unwavering determination. First, we need to protect Star at all costs. Caleb, the plan to take him to Paul's farm until the situation calms down here remains. Second, we're going to copy all these files as a guarantee. And third, she paused, a slight smile forming on her lips, we're going to find this treasure before Morgan. How? Asked Hannah and Caleb, almost in unison. Using the knowledge that Arthur left and Star's special ability. If there really is a treasure hidden in the lands of the old gold route, it doesn't belong to Morgan or to anyone individually. It belongs to the history of Virginia, to the American people. It should be in a museum, studied by historians, not disappear into some private collection or be melted down and sold on the black market. I completely agree, said Hannah, admiring the lady's determination. And I'm sure my editor will love this story. I can help with the research and document the entire process. But we need to be extremely careful, warned Eleanor. Morgan has resources and influence, and now we know he's willing to resort to criminal methods to get what he wants. She had barely finished speaking when Flash, who had been quiet at Eleanor's feet during the entire conversation, abruptly rose and began to bark toward the window. Caleb quickly approached, looking outside with caution. There's a car parking outside, he announced, tense. It's Morgan's car. Quick, Hannah, save all these files to a USB drive, instructed Eleanor, maintaining calm despite the evident tension in the air. Caleb, go to the stables and prepare Star to leave here as quickly as possible. Use the back trail that leads to Joshua's property. While Hannah searched in her bag for a USB drive and began copying the files, Caleb hurriedly left through the back door. Eleanor, with Flash's help, headed to the front porch, determined to confront Morgan and buy time for the others to execute their tasks. When Morgan climbed the porch steps, he found Eleanor sitting in her rocking chair, an image of serenity that contrasted with the tense atmosphere of the situation. Mrs. Eleanor, he greeted, the false cordiality transparent in his voice. I came as soon as I heard about the terrible incident. What a tragedy. A tragedy convenient for certain interests, isn't it, Mr. Morgan? Replied Eleanor, dispensing with formalities. Morgan cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the implicit accusation. I don't know what you're insinuating. I came to offer help. A fire is something devastating, especially for someone in your situation. My situation is perfectly under control, thank you. And as for your offer of help, I prefer to count on people I really trust. Morgan approached, his tone becoming more serious. Mrs. Eleanor, let's be direct. What happened was regrettable, but perhaps it's a sign that you need to reconsider my offer. Life in the countryside is becoming increasingly dangerous, especially for isolated properties like yours. That almost sounds like a threat, Mr. Morgan, replied Eleanor, without being intimidated. Not at all. It's just a realistic observation. By the way, I hope your special horse is well after all this confusion. Before Eleanor could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps announced Hannah's arrival. I see you have company, observed Morgan, a slight tone of irritation in his voice. Alexander Morgan, said Hannah, crossing her arms and facing the businessman. What a coincidence finding you here. And you are? Hannah Richards, investigative journalist with the Virginia Daily. I'm working on a report about the preservation of Golden Creek's historical heritage and the challenges faced by traditional properties like Star Ranch. Morgan's face, visibly, hardened. Richards, of course I've read some of your biased articles about real estate development in the historic region, always painting businessmen as villains and ignoring the economic progress we bring. I prefer to call my articles investigative, not biased, retorted Hannah with a challenging smile. I just follow the facts wherever they lead me. Morgan turned his attention back to Eleanor, deliberately ignoring the journalist. Mrs. Eleanor, I came to renew my offer for the horse. In fact, I'm willing to increase it considerably, $300,000. It's an amount that could help you rebuild what was damaged in the fire and still leave a good sum. Eleanor slowly shook her head. Mr. Morgan, no amount of money will buy Star or any piece of this ranch. This property and everything it contains is part of a historical and cultural legacy that I intend to preserve. You're being irrational, insisted Morgan, his frustration beginning to show. Think carefully. What can an elderly, blind and lonely lady do with an animal of that size? He needs specialized care, proper training. Star is receiving exactly the care he needs, interrupted Eleanor. And as for my ability to manage this ranch, I've been doing it successfully since Arthur fell ill more than 6 years ago. My vision may have gone, Mr. Morgan, but my competence and determination remain intact. Hannah observed the clash with growing admiration for Eleanor's firmness. Besides, continued the journalist, Mrs. Eleanor is not alone. She has the support of her dedicated team, her neighbors, and now the press. Last night's arson is already being investigated by the police, and the Virginia Daily will publish an article about the incident tomorrow. Morgan glared at Hannah with barely contained anger. Be careful what you insinuate, Miss Richards. Accusations without proof can result in lawsuits for defamation. I'm not making direct accusations, Mr. Morgan, just reporting facts. There was arson on the same night someone tried to steal a valuable horse after the owner of that animal refused a substantial purchase offer. Readers will draw their own conclusions. At that moment, Morgan's phone rang. He answered quickly, stepping away a few paces to speak privately. His expression changed from irritation to concern as he listened to the interlocutor. What do you mean he's not there? Morgan asked in a low voice, but not low enough to escape Eleanor's attentive ears. Look properly, you incompetent. Hanging up the phone forcefully, Morgan turned to Eleanor, abandoning any pretense of cordiality. Where is the horse, Mrs. Eleanor? In a safe place, away from people with dubious intentions, she replied calmly, and that's where he'll remain. You don't know who you're dealing with, threatened Morgan, approaching Eleanor. I have enough influence in this region to make your life very difficult. Flash growled threateningly, placing himself between Eleanor and the businessman. Hannah also took a step forward, positioning herself beside the elderly woman. And you seem not to know that I'm recording this conversation, retorted Hannah, discreetly raising her cell phone. Threatening an elderly lady won't look good in the newspapers, don't you think? Or on social media? Morgan backed away, realizing he was at a disadvantage. This isn't over, he declared, pointing his finger at Eleanor. You'll regret having refused my generous offer. The only thing I would regret would be betraying Arthur's legacy for money, replied Eleanor with dignity. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a lot of work ahead. Morgan descended the porch steps with large strides, entered his luxury car, and departed, raising dust as he accelerated abruptly along the ranch's path. As soon as the sound of the engine disappeared in the distance, Hannah let out a sigh of relief. Wow, you're amazing, Mrs. Eleanor. You faced him without showing a hint of fear. The fear exists, my dear, confessed Eleanor, caressing Flash's head to calm him. But I learned long ago that showing it to people like Morgan only makes them more dangerous. It's like dealing with wild animals. Never show weakness. Caleb returned hurriedly, breathless from running. Star is on his way to Mr. Joshua's farm, he informed. 2 of his men came to get him. and we'll take him through old trails where cars can't follow. From there, they'll continue to your nephew Paul's farm in the Blue Ridge Mountains." "Great work, Caleb," praised Eleanor, visibly relieved. "Hannah, did you manage to save the files?" "All of them," confirmed the journalist, displaying the USB drive in her hand. "And I've already sent copies to my email and to the newspaper's secure server, just as an additional guarantee." "Excellent. Now we need to prepare for the next step. Morgan won't give up easily, especially now that he's realized Star has been removed from the ranch. His last resort would be to try to break down your defenses legally through a property contestation," evaluated Hannah. "He's known for using flaws in old documentation to contest ownership in historic regions." "Our documents are in order," assured Eleanor. "Arthur was extremely meticulous about that, but still we need to act quickly. Hannah, you mentioned that your editor would support the coverage of this story. The more visibility we have, the harder it will be for Morgan to act in the shadows." "Certainly," agreed Hannah, already typing notes on her cell phone. "I'll start working on the article today, a story about a blind lady defending a historical heritage against an unscrupulous businessman will attract a lot of attention." "And what about the treasure?" asked Caleb in a low voice, looking around as if afraid of being heard. "If it really exists, how are we going to find it before Morgan?" Eleanor smiled, a gleam of determination on her face. "We'll follow the steps that Arthur planned. In 3 days is the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year. According to Arthur's notes, that would be the ideal moment to follow the clue mentioned in the old records, where the star touches the water when the sun rises on the shortest day of the year." She paused, as if mentally visualizing the plan. "Caleb, you and I will go to Paul's farm. We'll take Star to the starting point of the old drover's route at sunrise on the solstice. If Arthur's theories are correct, the animal's behavior will guide us to the exact location. And I'll document everything," completed Hannah, excited by the prospect of the adventure and the great report that would result from it. "But we need to be discreet," warned Eleanor. "Morgan will certainly have people observing our movements, and if he discovers our plan, he'll try to get there first," concluded Caleb, the concern evident in his voice. "And we don't know what he's capable of." Eleanor nodded gravely, aware of the challenge that awaited them. "That's why we need to be agile and intelligent. Virginia's history and Arthur's legacy depend on it." As the three finalized their plans on the porch, they didn't notice the discreet black vehicle parked at a distance on the dirt road, with a man using binoculars carefully observing every movement at Star Ranch. The first rays of the winter solstice sun tinged the sky with shades of orange and pink, while the morning mist hovered over the valleys of the Blue Ridge Mountains. At the highest point of an ancient drover's trail, 3 figures waited in silence. Eleanor, Caleb, and Hannah. Beside them, Star, the imposing golden-coated horse, moved restlessly, as if sensing the importance of that moment. "The sun is rising," announced Caleb, observing the horizon. "We're at the exact location described by Arthur in his notes, the beginning of the secret trail used by gold smugglers in the 18th century. Eleanor, mounted on Star with Caleb's help, felt the animal's energy beneath her. Even though she couldn't see the landscape, her other senses were sharpened. The smell of the damp vegetation, the sound of birds awakening, the cold breeze of the morning in the Virginia mountains. "Remember the plan," she said in a firm voice. "We'll follow the original trail and allow Star to guide us. Hannah, you'll document everything. Caleb, you'll describe to me any change in Star's behavior or in the surroundings." "I'm ready," confirmed Hannah, adjusting her professional camera. "Every moment will be recorded for posterity and for evidence, if we need it." "Let's give Star freedom now," instructed Eleanor. "Release the reins, Caleb, but stay close in case I need help." With gentleness, Caleb released the reins he was holding as a precaution. Eleanor, an experienced horsewoman even after losing her sight, leaned slightly forward and whispered in Star's ear, "Show us the way, Guardian. Show us what's in your ancestral memory." As if understanding the words, Star neighed softly and began to advance along the trail, almost erased by time. His step was firm and decided, very different from the normal behavior of a horse in unfamiliar terrain. "Amazing," murmured Hannah, photographing and filming as she followed alongside. "He seems to know exactly where he's going." During the first hour of the journey, Star followed the visible trail, gradually descending along the mountainside. But suddenly, to everyone's surprise, the animal veered to the right, abandoning the apparent path and heading toward a densely wooded area. "He's leaving the trail!" exclaimed Caleb, hurrying to keep up. "Mrs. Eleanor, are you all right?" "Perfectly," she replied with a serene smile. "Trust him, Caleb. This is exactly what Arthur described. The horses of the Star lineage know paths that are no longer visible to us." Passing among centennial trees and peculiar rock formations, Star led the group for approximately half an hour, until reaching a small clearing. In the center of it, a rock formation rose, with a configuration that vaguely resembled a five-pointed star. "It's unbelievable," said Caleb, describing the scene to Eleanor. "We're in a perfect clearing, with a star-shaped rock formation in the center, and there's a small stream that passes exactly through the middle of the formation." "The place where the star touches the water," murmured Eleanor, feeling shivers run through her body. "It's exactly as described in the old records." Hannah was frantically photographing, capturing every detail of the scene. "Observe the position of the rising sun," she pointed. "At this exact moment of the solstice, the first ray of sun is directly illuminating the point where the star-shaped rock meets the stream." Star advanced without hesitation to that precise point and began to paw the ground with his front hoof, a behavior so deliberate that it seemed almost human in its intentionality. "He's indicating something," said Caleb, cautiously approaching. "I think we need to dig here." With the tools they had brought, Caleb began to dig at the point indicated by Star. The soil was hard, compacted by centuries, but after a few minutes of effort, his shovel hit something solid that produced a metallic sound. "There's something here," he exclaimed, intensifying his efforts. Working carefully, Caleb unearthed a small metal chest corroded by time but still intact, with a complex locking system. "Hannah, can you describe the chest to me?" asked Eleanor, dismounting from Star, with Caleb's help. "It's a forged iron chest, approximately 20 inches long by 12 inches in width and height," described Hannah, examining the object without touching it. "It has ornate details typical of the colonial period, including the English crown's coat of arms. The lock seems extremely complex for the time." "How are we going to open it?" asked Caleb, looking around as if expecting someone to have followed. "Them." Eleanor smiled, removing from inside her jacket a small package wrapped in protective fabric. "With this," she said, unwrapping the package to reveal an ancient key made of bronze with elaborate designs on its handle. Arthur found it among his grandfather's belongings, along with notes about its possible origin. He suspected it was the key to the lost treasure, but never had the chance to test his theory. With hands trembling from excitement, Caleb took the key and carefully inserted it into the chest's lock. To everyone's surprise, it fit perfectly. With a firm movement, he turned the key, and the lock mechanism, although rusty from time, yielded with an audible click. "It worked!" exclaimed Hannah, almost dropping the camera from excitement. "What's inside?" asked Eleanor, her voice laden with emotion. Caleb slowly opened the lid of the chest, and a golden glow reflected the morning sunlight, illuminating their astonished faces. "Gold," he whispered, incredulous. "Gold bars, ancient coins, jewels. It really is a colonial treasure." Hannah was photographing frantically, documenting each exposed piece. "This is a monumental historical discovery," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "It's not just the monetary value, which must be astronomical. It's the incalculable historical and cultural value." "Exactly as Arthur would say," commented Eleanor, tears streaming down her face. "This treasure doesn't belong to us. It belongs to the history of America." In that solemn moment, the sound of breaking branches alerted the group. Caleb quickly turned, protectively placing himself in front of Eleanor. Hannah interrupted her photography, looking apprehensively in the direction of the noise. "Impressive," sounded Alexander Morgan's voice as he emerged from the vegetation, followed by two men of threatening appearance. "I must admit that I underestimated you, Mrs. Eleanor, and especially underestimated the capacity of this extraordinary animal." "Morgan," said Eleanor calmly, recognizing his voice, "it was to be expected that you would follow us." "It wasn't difficult," he replied with arrogance. "You weren't exactly discreet in your preparations, and I have enough resources to keep people watching your every move." He advanced a few steps, looking covetously at the open chest. "Now, if you don't mind, I'll take what I came for, both the treasure and the horse." "This treasure doesn't belong to you," declared Hannah, positioning herself beside Caleb. "It's a national historical heritage and should be handed over to the competent authorities." Morgan laughed with disdain. "And who's going to stop me? You three? We're in the middle of nowhere, without communication, without witnesses." "You're mistaken," interrupted Hannah, displaying her cell phone. "We've been streaming live since we left the ranch. Everything is being sent directly to the Virginia Daily server, including this conversation and your implicit threats." Morgan's confident expression visibly faltered. "Besides," continued Eleanor, "we're not alone." As if in response to her words, the sound of motors and voices rapidly approached. In a few moments, the clearing was invaded by a group led by Sheriff Foster, accompanied by police officers and the team of archaeologists from the National Historical and Artistic Heritage Institute, NHRE, that Hannah had previously contacted. "Alexander Morgan," the sheriff formally announced, "you are detained for questioning on suspicion of involvement in arson, attempted theft, and now apparent attempt to appropriate historical heritage." While the police officers approached Morgan and his henchmen, the head of the team of archaeologists, Dr. Marianne Coleman, approached the chest with professional reverence. "This is extraordinary," she commented, carefully examining the contents. "A discovery that could rewrite parts of the history of the gold cycle in Virginia. Mrs. Eleanor, you have rendered an invaluable service to American cultural heritage." Eleanor smiled, a sensation of peace and fulfillment taking over her as she caressed Star's neck, who remained tranquilly by her side. "It wasn't me," she replied with humility. "It was Arthur, through years of research and dedication, and it was Star, the last guardian of a secret that spanned centuries." 3 months later, a solemn ceremony was taking place at the newly inaugurated Star Ranch Cultural Center. The old property, now fully restored, had been transformed into a living museum of Virginia history, with the main house housing permanent exhibitions on the gold cycle and the importance of the Star lineage horses in that period. In the central courtyard, where a life-size statue of Star had been erected, Eleanor, elegantly dressed, cut the inaugural ribbon, assisted by authorities, journalists, and dozens of enthusiastic visitors. With the discovery of the colonial treasure and the subsequent exposure of Alexander Morgan's illicit activities, Star Ranch has not only been saved, but has become a symbol of cultural resistance and historical preservation, announced the event presenter. The treasure, valued in the millions, was entirely donated by Mrs. Eleanor Sanders to the National Historical Heritage, with the condition that part of it remain exhibited here, in the place where the legacy of the Star lineage was created. After the official speeches, Hannah, now nationally recognized for the series of award-winning reports on the case, approached Eleanor. "How do you feel, Mrs. Eleanor?" she asked, affectionately embracing the elderly woman who had become her friend. "Fulfilled," replied Eleanor with a serene smile. "Arthur would be proud. Star Ranch will continue to be a place of preservation and learning for future generations." "And what about Star?" asked Hannah, looking at the magnificent animal that grazed peacefully in the adjacent field, now part of a controlled breeding program to try to recover characteristics of the historical lineage. "He will fulfill his destiny as guardian of a tradition," replied Eleanor. "And through him, the memory of this land and its people will continue to live, like the stars that, even invisible during the day, continue to shine in the sky." As the sun began to set on the horizon of Golden Creek, casting a golden light over the property, Eleanor walked with Flash's help to the field where Star was grazing. The animal raised its head upon sensing her approach and came to meet her, gently rubbing its muzzle against her extended hand. "Thank you, my friend," she whispered, feeling the deep connection they had developed on that extraordinary journey. Together, we preserve not just a material treasure, but the true gold of our history,